I thought the worst thing my family could ever do was ignore me. I was wrong. One morning, I received a formal letter signed by my own mother. It said that I'd been completely removed from her will. The reason? Your success was just luck. You don't deserve anything. I couldn't breathe. I had worked for years to build something from nothing, only to be told that none of it mattered. I didn't know what hurt more, being erased like I never existed, or knowing they never truly believed in me. But that was just the beginning of something much worse. If you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own family, stay with me. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about rising when no one expects you to. I'm someone who built a tech startup from scratch. I started with no connections, no backing, just a laptop, a dream, and too many sleepless nights to count. Eventually, I sold that company for several $1,000,000. People saw the headlines, the success, but what they didn't see was the cost and where I came from. Growing up, I was always in the background. My younger sibling, Emily, was the golden child, praised, supported, spoiled. Meanwhile, I got used to hand-me-down silence and looks of disappointment. The only person who ever believed in me was my grandmother. She taught me about independence, resilience, and what it means to plant seeds no one else can see. She passed away just before I made it big. I thought my family might finally be proud of me. Instead, they erased me, literally. And just when I thought I could move on, they came back. Not to make peace, but to demand money. I never really felt like I belonged in my own family. From a young age, I could tell there was a difference in how I was treated. My younger sibling, Emily, was adored. She got new clothes, the latest gadgets, endless praise for even the smallest achievements. I, on the other hand, was the afterthought. Hand-me-downs, quiet nods, and phrases like, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became a part of my everyday life. Birthdays were always the clearest example. Emily would get full-on parties with balloons, cakes, and all her friends invited. When it was my turn, my parents would say, "You're older now. You don't need all that." I remember once getting a used book while Emily unwrapped a brand new bike. It wasn't about the gifts, it was the message. She mattered. I didn't. Still, I didn't rebel. I threw myself into school instead. I studied hard-earned scholarships and even graduated at the top of my class. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would finally make them proud. It didn't. When I told them I got into a top university with a full scholarship, my dad replied, "Let's see if you can actually finish it." My mom just said, "That's nice." Emily's applying to art school. We're helping her with the fees. They never once offered me a dime, not for tuition books or living expenses. I worked 3 part-time jobs just to get by. I'd often come home late, too exhausted to eat, sometimes sleeping on the floor of a shared apartment. And yet I never asked them for help. Maybe deep down, I wanted to prove I could do it alone. The only person who ever truly supported me was my grandmother, my mom's mother, Margaret. She wasn't wealthy, but she was wise and incredibly kind. When I visited her during school breaks, she'd cook for me, listen to me, and tell me stories about building a life with integrity. She used to say, "You have a quiet fire in you. Don't let them put it out." She knew how my parents treated me. I could see it in her eyes, the sadness, the guilt. But she never openly criticized them. Instead, she poured love into me quietly. Before she passed, she gave me a small envelope and said, "It's not much, but maybe you can plant something with this. Inside was a check for $12,000, her life savings. That money didn't just help me survive. It helped me start. I used that seed to begin building my startup. It wasn't glamorous at first. I coded from borrowed spaces, pitched to investors who barely looked at me, and made mistake after mistake. For a while, I thought I'd failed, but something in me refused to give up. And then I found traction. I landed a mentor, someone who believed in my ideas. I got my first real contract, then another, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Revenue came in. I hired a team. Media started covering us. I was finally living the life I dreamed of, not because anyone handed it to me, but because I fought for it. That's when I got the letter. It came in a pristine white envelope with formal language and legal formatting. My name was mentioned once, right at the top, stating I had been removed from the will. Everything it said would go to Emily. The reasoning, as stated in a personal note from my mother, was that I was already taken care of, and that the money should go to someone who truly needs it. I stared at that line for hours. I had worked harder than anyone I knew. I had built everything myself without their help, without their belief. And now they used my success as an excuse to erase me completely. Still, I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. I had built my own life. But what I didn't expect was what came next. Just a few months after that letter, my parents showed up at my office. I hadn't seen them in years. They brought Emily with them, visibly pregnant, stressed eyes hollow. I remember thinking, this isn't a family visit. This is something else. They sat down, and my father launched into a story about financial troubles. He said they were in debt, their house was at risk, and Emily's pregnancy had complications. My mother added that it was time for the family to come together. Then they said something I'll never forget. You promised years ago that if you ever made it, you'd help us. We're here to ask you to honor that. At first, I thought I misheard. I asked them what they were talking about. That's when they pulled out a folded paper, crumpled and old. It was a note I'd written almost a decade ago during college. A sentimental letter saying, one day when I'm successful, I'll make sure my family is okay. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't even recent. But they acted like it was a binding legal agreement. I told them gently but firmly that I wasn't in a position to hand out money. My business, while profitable, still needed reinvestment. And more importantly, I felt betrayed, not just by the will, but by the way they'd treated me my entire life. That's when the atmosphere changed. My father's tone turned cold. He stood up and said, "Then I guess we'll let the court decide." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. A few weeks later, I was served with legal documents. My own family was suing me based on a personal letter I wrote in my 20s. And just like that, the battle truly began. I never thought I'd find myself in a courtroom, especially not facing my own family. But that's where I ended up, sitting across from the people who raised me. People who once told me family always comes first. Now, they were treating me like an enemy. Over a vague, sentimental note I wrote during college, the lawsuit claimed I had made a verbal and written promise to support my family if I ever became wealthy, and now that I had, I owed them. They accused me of emotional fraud, breach of verbal contract, and abandoning familial duty. None of it made any legal sense, but they weren't just after my money. They were after a form of control. They had lost. I hired a lawyer, someone experienced in family disputes and inheritance cases. Her name was Dana, and from the very first consultation, she didn't sugarcoat anything. "This isn't about the note," she said, flipping through the documents. "This is about resentment. They don't understand how you succeeded without them, and that terrifies them." The legal side was clear. The note wasn't enforceable, and no contract existed. But perception mattered, especially if it went to trial. The emotional weight behind their accusations could sway a jury. I needed more than facts. I needed context. So we started digging. I began collecting old emails, texts, anything that could establish a pattern of neglect and emotional manipulation. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep the dysfunction ran. There were messages from my mother dismissing my startup plans as childish texts from my father telling me to get a real job, and even one from Emily joking about how I was just playing pretend entrepreneur. Then I found something I had completely forgotten about, an old voice message from my grandmother left shortly before she passed away. In it, she said, "I know you've always been alone in that house. I'm proud of you for leaving and making something on your own. You don't owe them anything." That audio hit me harder than I expected. For years, I thought I'd been imagining the neglect, maybe even exaggerating it in my mind. But hearing her say it, without prompting, without bitterness, validated everything. Then Dana found a legal twist that changed everything. While reviewing the terms of my grandmother's will, Dana discovered that the inheritance I received wasn't just a gift. My grandmother had formally stated in a notarized document that she was leaving everything to me because she believed my parents were not fit to manage or respect the value of hard-earned money. That clause, buried in the legal jargon, made it clear this wasn't just about family drama. My grandmother had intentionally bypassed her own daughter and made sure her reasons were documented. Dana's eyes lit up. "This changes the entire narrative. You didn't just succeed on your own. You were entrusted with that seed money because someone believed you were the only one worthy of it." Still, the emotional toll was staggering. Every day I saw headlines twisting the story: tech founder sued by parents' millionaire child. Millionaire child refuses to help pregnant sister. Family torn apart by greed. None of them asked what really happened. No one wondered what it had cost me to get here. All they saw was someone who had money and refused to give it away. The public pressure mounted. Anonymous emails poured in. Some accused me of being heartless. Others told me to pay them and move on. But I couldn't. This wasn't about a check. This was about dignity. One night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office alone, staring at the city skyline. Everything I had built was just outside that window. Clients' contracts, people who believed in me. But inside, I still felt like that kid who used to eat dinner last, who had to earn love that never came. That's when I made a decision. I would fight not just to win, but to reclaim my story. So we escalated. Dana subpoenaed bank records that revealed something disturbing. My parents, who claimed they were broke, had recently transferred a large sum to a private consultant with a suspicious connection to Emily's ex-boyfriend, a man known for shady deals. It wasn't about survival. It was about leverage. They saw my success as a golden ticket, and when I didn't hand it over, they decided to force it. During one of the pre-trial mediation sessions, I faced them directly for the first time in months. My mother looked tired. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. Emily, she looked ashamed. "I never wanted this to get this far," she whispered when we were alone for a moment in the hallway. "Then why didn't you stop it?" I asked. She didn't have an answer. That night, I received a message from someone I never expected, Emily's former roommate. She said Emily had admitted that the lawsuit was more our parents' idea than hers. They had convinced her it was the only way to restore balance in the family. But what really broke me was when she rewrote. They told her you owed it to her because you got the brains and she got stuck taking care of them. That line hit me like a punch. I didn't ask for the brains. I didn't ask to be treated differently. But I did ask once for recognition. I just never expected the price of that recognition to be betrayal. By the time the court date arrived, we had everything: documents, witness statements, financial records, even expert testimony from a psychologist explaining the long-term effects of parental neglect. The judge allowed the full history to be presented. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about who we had all become and why. And that's when the real twist came. As Dana was presenting the clause from my grandmother's will, she paused and added, "We also discovered that the plaintiff, Emily, received $55,000 from the grandmother's estate via a secret transfer done through a side trust. This information was intentionally withheld during early disclosures." Gasps filled the courtroom. My parents had lied. Emily had already received her share and more, but they wanted it all. Suddenly, the picture changed. Sympathy shifted. And for the first time, I wasn't the villain in someone else's story. I was just a person who had finally said, enough. I thought the courtroom would bring closure. I thought that once everything came out, every lie, every hidden bank transfer, every cruel message, it would end. But I was wrong. After the revelation about the secret $50,000 transfer Emily received, the judge ordered a temporary halt to the proceedings for financial review. For a few days, it seemed like things were finally swinging in my favor. My parents' narrative was cracking. Their image of being desperate victims was starting to collapse. And yet, I didn't feel relieved. I felt exhausted. And that's when the phone call came. Emily. She asked to meet alone. Against Dana's advice, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from the noise, away from the media. She looked nothing like the sister I remembered. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes tired, her voice shaky. I didn't know about the trust, she said immediately. They told me everything was left to you. They convinced me this was the only way to be treated fairly. Then why lie in court? I asked. She hesitated, then said the words, "I'll never forget," because they said if I didn't help them, I'd lose what little love I had left from them. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. We were both raised in the same house by the same people, but while I was punished for being different, Emily was rewarded for being obedient. She was their favorite, but even that came with a price. She had never learned how to stand on her own. Now she was married to someone she didn't trust, pregnant with twins, and stuck in a financial mess. And they were still controlling her like they tried to control me. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't know how to say no. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say that sorry didn't erase the pain of standing alone at family gatherings, of being accused publicly, of having to justify my own worth in court. But instead, I said, I know, because I did. The real enemy wasn't Emily. It was the generational rot. The manipulation masked as love. The conditional affection. The way they pit us against each other and then blamed us when it all fell apart. Back in court, things got uglier. My parents refused to acknowledge the trust. They said I must have fabricated it. They accused Dana of tampering with the will. They called a surprise witness, my uncle, who hadn't spoken to me in years. He sat in the witness chair and said, "That note, the one about helping the family. I remember when they found it. They cried. They believed it, and now he's pretending it never mattered. Dana leaned over and whispered, "They're not playing by legal rules anymore. They're playing emotional warfare." I stayed silent. Let them talk. Let the lies pile up. Because we had something stronger truth. The final week of trial arrived. My turn to speak. The courtroom was silent as I took the stand. Dana had prepped me for hours, but I tossed the prep aside. I spoke from memory, from pain, from the core of everything I had endured. I was told I was lucky, I said, that my success was a fluke, that I should be grateful and give back. But no one asked what I gave up. I built something from nothing. Not because I was helped, but because I was ignored. Because when you have no safety net, you learn to fly on your own. I looked directly at my mother. She looked away. I continued. That note they keep quoting. I wrote it when I was 19. I was broke. I still believed love meant giving until you had nothing left. I hadn't yet learned that real love doesn't ask you to bleed for it. A quiet gasp came from someone in the back row. I kept going. They didn't sue me because they needed money. They sued me because they lost control. Because I stopped asking for approval. Because I stopped being the version of myself they were comfortable with. When I stepped down, the courtroom was dead quiet. Even the judge seemed moved. Then came the final blow. Dana submitted a private financial audit conducted legally under court order that revealed my parents had been transferring money from Emily's accounts without her consent. They had taken over $80,000 over the past 2 years, moving it through shell businesses under my father's name. It wasn't just emotional abuse. It was financial exploitation. Emily broke down in court. She confessed everything. She confirmed that the lawsuit wasn't her idea, that she'd been manipulated, that her signature had been added to documents she didn't understand. I was scared, she said through tears. They told me I'd lose everything if I didn't go along, but I already lost the only person who ever treated me like I could be more than just obedient. She meant me. The judge called for an immediate recess. Outside the courtroom, Dana turned to me and said, "We won. It's not over yet, but we won where it mattered." Truth always leaves a trace. But I didn't feel like a winner. I felt free. Like I had finally let go of the weight I'd been carrying for years. The need to be enough. The need to prove I deserved love. The need to explain why I said no. And then the ruling came. The judge dismissed the lawsuit entirely, ordered my parents to pay all legal fees, opened a formal inquiry into their finances, and most surprisingly, placed a temporary financial conservatorship over Emily's accounts to protect her from further harm. I walked out of that courtroom into a wall of cameras and microphones. I said nothing, just smiled and kept walking. But later that night, I sent one email to Emily. "I forgive you, but I can't save you." She replied, "You already did." The days after the verdict felt hollow. I had won, technically. The lawsuit was dismissed. My name was cleared, and their manipulation was exposed. Yet somehow, I still didn't feel triumphant. I just felt emptied. Like I had spent so many years surviving a storm that when the silence finally came, I didn't know what to do with it. I went back to my apartment, closed the door, sat on the floor. For hours, I stared at nothing. Dana had suggested I take a vacation, somewhere warm, somewhere peaceful. "You deserve it," she said. But what I needed wasn't a break. It was a reckoning. I needed to look at the parts of myself I had buried under layers of ambition, defense mechanisms, and guilt. So instead of going on a tropical getaway, I drove to the old neighborhood. The house I grew up in had a fresh coat of paint, but the same rusting fence. I parked across the street and sat for a long time. I remembered watching snow fall from that upstairs window. I remembered the time I got an award at school, and no one came. I remembered the exact sound of my mother's voice when she said, "Don't expect praise for doing what you're supposed to." I hadn't come here for nostalgia. I came to let something go. A few blocks away was another house, one I hadn't visited in over a decade, my grandmother's. It had been sold after her passing, but I still remembered the lilac tree in the front yard. She had planted it herself, said it would bloom every spring, no matter how cold the winter before. I stood there, staring at that tree, now taller than the roof. That tree was everything she believed in: resilience, quiet growth, and blooming on your own terms. I whispered, "I did it." And for the first time in years, I cried. Not because I was hurt, but because I had finally stopped running. I returned home with a decision already made. The victory wasn't enough. I didn't just want to survive the damage my family caused, I wanted to transform it. Turn it into something useful. Not for them, not even for me, but for someone else out there who had been told they didn't matter. That's when I started the process of creating a foundation. Not in my name, but in my grandmother's. The Margaret Foundation for Independent Thinkers. It would offer scholarships and mentorship programs for young people from toxic family environments. People who had potential, but no support. People who were told they were only valuable when they stayed silent. I poured myself into the work. I met with educators, therapists, and social workers. I read every piece of research I could find on family systems and intergenerational trauma. I hired a team not from my tech circle, but people who had lived through similar battles. One day during a planning session, someone asked, "What inspired this?" I hesitated, then said, "Not a what, a someone who loved me quietly and believed in me when no one else did." They nodded, but I knew they didn't know the whole story, and I didn't need them to. That part was mine to carry. A few months later, I got a letter, handwritten, from Emily. She said she had moved out of her husband's house, was raising the twins alone, was in therapy. She said she had read about the foundation and cried when she saw our grandmother's name. "I never saw you clearly," she wrote. "You were always the brave one. I was just too scared to admit it." She included a photo of her daughters and a note, "If they ever grow up to be like you, I'll be proud." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure I needed to, but I saved the photo because for the first time, it felt like maybe the cycle had a chance of breaking. My parents, on the other hand, disappeared from public view. The financial inquiry led to frozen assets and potential charges. I didn't follow every detail. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had already won by no longer needing their apology. The turning point wasn't the court ruling. It wasn't the foundation launch. It was the day I stopped seeking validation from people committed to misunderstanding me. It was the moment I realized freedom isn't just walking away. It's choosing not to carry their voices in your head anymore. From then on, I rebuilt my life slowly, not as a reaction to their betrayal, but as an intentional, quiet act of self-respect. I reconnected with a few old friends I had pushed away during the lawsuit. I opened up to someone new, someone who didn't need me to perform or prove anything. We weren't official yet, but for once, I wasn't scared of being seen fully. At a conference later that year, I gave a talk. The title was simple: What They Said I Couldn't Do. I didn't talk about the lawsuit, or my parents, or even the company. I talked about lilac trees and the quiet strength of blooming without permission. The crowd stood in applause, but I didn't need it, because finally, I was clapping for myself. A year later, the foundation had already funded its first 5 scholarships. One of the recipients, a brilliant teenager named Alex, sent me a letter. He'd grown up in foster care after being abandoned by his parents. He wrote, "For the first time, I feel like someone sees me. Not as a problem to fix, but as someone with potential." That letter meant more to me than any investment deal I'd ever closed. Meanwhile, Emily reached out again, this time with a longer message. She didn't ask for money. She didn't bring up the lawsuit. She just said thank you for not becoming like them, for showing her a different way to live. I wasn't ready to rebuild a sibling relationship, but I could recognize her effort. I told her I hoped she was healing. That was all, and that was enough. As for my parents, they stayed silent. Their assets had been seized after a deeper audit revealed years of misrepresentation. I never celebrated their downfall. It wasn't satisfying to watch them crumble, but it was clarifying. Actions have consequences, even for people who once made you believe they were above accountability. And that, I realized, was the real closure, not revenge, but truth revealed. I kept my distance. No holiday calls. No lingering resentment either. Just space clean, quiet, and mine. I built a new life, one where I didn't need to shrink myself to make others comfortable. I worked with young entrepreneurs, mentored people who came from complicated homes. I shared what I had learned not just about business, but about boundaries, healing, and self-trust. And every year, when the lilac tree bloomed outside what was once my grandmother's house, I drove by. Not out of grief, but out of gratitude. She had planted something more than a tree. She planted a future I was now living. There was one final piece left. I wrote a letter to myself, to the version of me that once cried alone in a college dorm, wondering if I'd ever be enough, to the kid who celebrated straight A's with no one to clap, to the adult who fought a lawsuit just to defend their right to exist with dignity. You did it, I wrote, not because they believed in you, but because you did. I folded that letter and tucked it into a journal. Someday maybe I'll show it to someone who needs it. Because if I learned anything from this entire journey, it's this: you don't owe love to those who weaponize it. You don't have to earn your family's approval by sacrificing your peace. And no matter how many times they try to rewrite your story, you have the power to take the pen back. Your past doesn't get to dictate your worth. Only you do. So, if you're out there listening, feeling erased, underestimated, or discarded, know this: you are not a mistake. You are not what they called you when they were angry. You are not broken. You are becoming. And that is powerful. Thanks for listening. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've ever been underestimated, remember, you're not alone. The next chapter is yours to write.